Senate Bill 330. Senate Bill 330 also addresses streamlining and a couple other things, and it does prohibit downzoning of land from a higher density to a lower density, or from a residential zoning to something that doesn't allow residential. It also does apply to the process for reviewing certain affordable projects. Assembly Bill 686. This is what calls for the fair housing assessment that I mentioned a minute ago. As you can see, there are many pieces to this analysis and what's required under this law. It addresses mobility and transit. It addresses characteristics of households in the different areas of the unincorporated county. And we look at tenant protection issues, if there are any, and also displacement issues. We look at things like environmental health and whether or not there are areas that have more challenges with that. We look at income, and we look at the geographic distribution of these trends. So that is just a snapshot of all of the things that come together on this issue. And then we also look at how all of these fair housing issues interact with the sites that are identified in the housing element. So that will be also part of that analysis. And I'm going to turn it over to Amalia now to talk about the regional housing needs.
Thank you, Amy. So this is an acronym known as RHNA. It stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And this is a number that is handed to the county from our Regional Association of Governments, ABAG. ABAG got an overall number for the entire Bay Area, and they went through a lengthy process that resulted in numbers being given to every jurisdiction. Next slide, please. And this happens for every housing element cycle. So every jurisdiction in the Bay Area got their number at the same time. And it was a big number for the Bay Area. Overall, California is kind of challenging itself to provide more housing at every income level. And ultimately, the county was assigned 7,610 units, which, is a big increase, almost fourfold increase from our current fifth cycle RHNA number. Next slide, please. Yeah, big number. Next slide, please. Very big number. And so this is assigned also by income category, where we have about 2,000 units to show we have capacity for in the very low income. That's less than 50% of median. Low income, about 1,200 units. Moderate income, about 1,200 units. And then above moderate make up the balance of 3,100 units. And that shows the income range. Currently median for a 4-person household is 125,000. And usually that number gets updated in the spring every year. So we'll be working with a different number shortly, but we just don't know how it will change. So we'll move on from there. I would imagine you're thinking of questions now about RHNA. Feel free to throw those in the chat, and we'll get to them either before breakout rooms or afterwards. Next slide, please. Amy, you're going to cover this one, or I'm covering this one. Okay, so part of what it goes into the housing element is a lot, like Amy covered all these required pieces. And so we have to show that we've got some strategies to meet this number. And these strategies can really be a range of things. And we're looking for some ideas that you might have as well. And feel free to suggest them if you're in that breakout room, or send them to us later. And we gotta look at a lot of things, right? And certainly parcels with potential to support more residential units are already being identified through the existing general plan process, as well as through the housing element process. So essentially, we're taking a closer look at a lot of parcels that have already been identified as suitable for residential, and really challenging ourselves to intensify that, really focus on ones that have great access to transit and services. Those are more suitable for perhaps the lower income categories because they fit a lot of the state funding criteria. We need to focus on sites for this that are right-sized, bigger than a ½ acre, smaller than 10 acres. Really, in our case, I mean, it's going to be much smaller than 10 acres, right? It's going to be more like 2 to 3 acres. Seems like kind of a sweet spot where you can get a good number of units on a property and provide some open space on site and park it to some extent. We're looking at vacant and underutilized sites, of course, everyone is. And we're also, you know, state law has really changed in the last 2 years relative to ADUs. So we're going to try to be realistic about the number of ADUs that count towards our arena. And there's some reasons why it's not going to solve all our problems, and nor would we want them to. But we are aware, of course, of all the changes in state law supporting more ADUs, and we're rolling that in as appropriate. So I'm really happy everyone could join us tonight for this element of public participation. We started off with kind of small group meetings, both with stakeholders, as well as a couple of focus group meetings for folks providing services to people living in supportive housing, as well as housing developers, both market and affordable. And we came to the Board of Supervisors for a study session, which was sort of like our formal kickoff back in December. We're having this community meeting now, and we're working towards bringing a draft to the Planning Commission and or the Board of Supervisors sometime this spring. May is a good enough guesstimate for now. It really just depends on a lot of factors, including their meeting schedules and how other things go with the general plan and the amount of work you know, that we need to do to finish the draft. So hopefully May. I can't give you a date to mark your calendars yet for these upcoming public meetings.
Great. Thanks, Amalia. We wanted to touch on our project schedule. So similar to some of what Amalia just mentioned, we've been gathering data and doing some outreach so far and working with the county to get our analysis dialed in. We should have a draft available in the March-April timeframe, and then the meetings that Amalia mentioned. And then we'll be going through the review process with the state and striving to hit that adoption deadline of the end of January next year, if not earlier. So we are now going to move to the breakout room portion of the presentation, but I do think that we have a little bit of time to take some questions. So I am going to stop sharing for a minute so that I can see some of the questions. And I guess, Maria, I don't see any questions that you've sent me. So can you let us know if we've received any?
I'm noting the questions down. I've been juggling a lot of stuff right now, but I'm going to send you the document right now. Let me just get that to you.
Okay, well, why don't I take a peek at the chat and see if there's any that I can start talking about. So I see we have a question. Someone asked if ADUs count toward the housing element requirements, and ADUs do count when they're built. They can be counted by the county towards the regional housing need number. In terms of the housing element, planning for ADUs in the future, there is a formula that the state will accept to project out accessory dwelling units. And the county is considering that. I think Amalia mentioned that as part of her presentation.
So they count, they sort of count. They don't not count.
They are more certain once they've actually been approved, but there is an acceptable amount that can be projected if a jurisdiction chooses to.
Amy, it looks like there's a hand raised.
Okay, we would prefer to have questions sent through the chat if possible. And I'm gonna start with the ones that are in the chat, and then we'll go from there. We're also, if we run out of time right now, we'll continue with some Q&A at the end of the meeting. Somebody asked if the fair housing data analysis is supposed to precede the site selection. So the draft housing element, which will first go to the county for review, and then it will be, we'll address the county's review, and then there will be a public draft that will include the fair housing analysis and the site analysis, and they all get worked on together. So one doesn't come before the other, but they will all be in the draft together. Somebody asked why there were 3,000 units allocated to the over 150,000 shown on the slide. So I believe that's the above moderate category. Let me just check that in the PowerPoint. Right, so there is a process that wrapped up at the end of last year when the RENA numbers were adopted by the Association of Bay Area Governments, the regional agency, and that took into account, the current population in unincorporated Contra Costa County, the projections for how that's anticipated to grow, and the needs. So, who needs housing? So that is a minimum number. And so if locally the feeling is that more units are needed in other categories, then it is definitely the county's prerogative to plan for greater amounts in different income categories.
Yeah, and I'll chime in there to say, I'm not sure what perspective the question was coming from, but we really can't answer any questions about why these numbers ended up the way they did, because they're not our number. They were given to us by ABAG. We can certainly address what and how, but we can't go back in time and speak with any specifics about why did we get this number and why is it so big. We got it. We got to move on.
Thanks, Amalia. Another question is, will there be any attempt to quantify the number of units that could be produced under Senate Bill 9? I don't know if the county wants to speak to that at all.
Well, you should tune into the Planning Commission, which is happening at 6:30 tonight, because our approach is scheduled for review by the Planning Commission. It's being handled by another planner out of another division, but there is some guesstimating about how many parcels are, I don't want to say subject to SB 9, or would look most likely under SB 9 or eligible. And I believe it's in the 18,000 range. But there is that staff report posted online now, which really goes into the county's detailed approach for SB 9. So there will be some consideration of that. I would say, like ADUs, it's not going to be, we can't base our entire strategy around that, but certainly it's going to be a factor. And if someone has handy the agenda link to CPC tonight with that staff report, it might be nice to drop it into the chat, one of my colleagues. Thanks.
Thanks, Amalia. So the last question before we go to the breakout rooms, and then we'll take additional questions after that, is what percentage of the sites in the 5th cycle housing element actually turned into housing? What percentage are you assuming will turn into housing in the 6th cycle? For example, if there are 35,000 homes in the site's inventory and you assume a 20% chance of development, you get 7,000 homes. So I don't know if we have all of the, if we have the response on the 5th cycle at our fingertips tonight. We're definitely happy to gather that data.
We've not even thought of it like that. So no, we don't have an answer to the 5th cycle.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to share my screen again.
And I want to emphasize, keep your questions coming. You can bring them back. Our breakout rooms will end around 6:35. We'll come back together, share out from the breakout rooms, and go through more questions. I mean, hopefully we'll get to all the questions. If there's a slew, we might not, but then we can always respond to them later and share. And this meeting will be posted on the general plan / housing element website, eventually in a few days, week, and probably some of the sharings as well.
Great. So we are going to move into the small group portion of our discussion. We do have 5 different groups on different topics. We did send out some messages asking folks to choose their top choice topic if they had one. And thank you, all of you who responded. We are going to have about 35 minutes for this discussion, and then we'll come back together, hear some of what all of us talked about, and then as we mentioned, then we'll have some time for any additional questions that weren't related to the breakout rooms. So Maria, if you want to go ahead and work the magic, and you'll be seeing something pop up on your screen to ask you to join your room, and you can go ahead and click on that. Or the note taker from group 1 would like to give a brief report back.
Sure. Our note taker had to run to go to the planning commission meeting, and I haven't got his notes up yet, but we had a good discussion. We had some great comments. A lot of folks interested in Rodeo, in Alamo, in questions about various reuse of the housing authority sites, combining commercial and residential. Yeah, it was a good discussion.
Great, thank you, Chris. Group 2.
So at the beginning of the I guess the meeting, we had a lot of questions regarding unincorporated versus incorporated. We try to nail down the answers and give people like a perspective of what it was exactly that unincorporated was versus incorporated. That took a minute. After that, we kind of like spoke more about the funding and where it comes from and who does it go to and how the process is that it's allocated. We also spoke about leveraging as far as like what's where it's best to use the money. We had some opinions that it would be good to use the money towards rehab and preservation and acquisition rather than building new housing, because there's there might be good to work in conjunction with a preservation plan and see how that would work and if that would help. Kristen, do you want to add anything else?
I think the only thing to add was a comment or a question of how involved the housing authorities have been involved in the housing element conversation, but maybe a potential for combined supernova, for funding availability for trying to combine housing authority funds with Measure X or some of the other funding sources, which I thought was something I hadn't necessarily thought of. So food for thought.
Thanks. And sorry, got the question to say which group is which. So the first group is the sites inventory. The second group is affordable housing funding. So the funds that the county receives for affordable housing. The third group has to do with the local inclusionary housing and density bonus, so also related to affordable housing. And sorry, I lost track. I think we're now moving to the third group. All right, there we go.
Yes, hi. We had some great discussions. In general, there was some frustration with the limited tools we have and how to house everyone at a price that they can afford, and just talking about the general shortage of low-income households versus overbuilt with market households. We spoke a bit about zoning and how in certain places like Alamo, it's virtually impossible to build a multifamily type building there. And we also spoke about fees, either eradicating the in lieu fee or raising it. And we went over some of the we can't just wave a magic wand to fix that. We have to go through methods, and there's a process to do that. So it was a great discussion. Amalia, did you have anything else to add?
Great, thank you, Kathy. So my group was the group that talked about other strategies to address housing needs and to think about for the housing element. I'm going to let Christine give some of the notes, but first we talked about some of the programs that are in the current housing element and got some feedback on those. And then we talked about ideas for what else could be pursued possibly. So thanks, Christine.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Excuse me. So there was consensus that a lot of the existing programs that are listed should be maintained. And in terms of helping to, I guess, there was a discussion regarding rethinking about preservation of housing and preservation of unsubsidized housing units through perhaps a acquisition rehab program and providing properties that the county acquires to community land trusts or to an emergency rental assistance program. I think there were comments with regards to the existing strategies being maintained because they are critical in a way to keep people in their homes as well as to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I think there were some comments regarding supporting more infill projects and to provide more affordability by design options or strategies. There were also strategies regarding the county possibly providing incentives to do accessory dwelling units on properties or to do more in terms of promoting that for a lot of the properties within the county. And so I think there was also some additional discussion about providing financing for accessory dwelling units in combination with the county securing tax defaulted properties and then transferring it to developers or community land trusts to develop and maintain or improve those properties and to provide incentives for the development of additional units on I guess it sounded like single family residential sites. There was some discussion about parking reform in certain multifamily projects where transit can be utilized to reduce that development cost. There's also some ideas with regards to repurposing commercial use buildings or rezoning commercial use buildings and offices or former industrial buildings perhaps that might be underutilized or unused so that housing can be constructed there. And finally, there was some discussion with regards to housing and taking into account hazards from climate change, wildfires, flooding, and I guess providing that into consideration towards where we would build new housing units, possibly green construction training programs so that there is a jobs and training and housing link. And those are all my notes.
Thanks, Christine. The last group, group 5, talked about fair housing.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So we covered a lot of ground. We had some residents and other attendees share their experiences with fair housing related to overcrowding, discrepancies in where lower income housing is permitted or built, and the access to resources that influences, as well as gaps in services and eligibility for services. So someone might need access to a service, but not quite meet that. So that was really useful information. And we also discussed historic policies, local and state policies that have influenced or not influenced fair housing and how we can make the programs in this housing element actually move the needle in promoting and affirmatively furthering fair housing. So we did cover a lot of ground and we have all the notes in detail, but the big conversation was being most effective in making sure that everyone has access to fair and affordable housing, safe housing, ensuring that there is equal review of housing units, not just mansions and ignoring lower income housing, but making sure everyone has equal access. So that's what we covered.
Great, thank you, everybody. Excited to see the details of the discussions after this. We do now have some time to take more questions that you've been including in the chat. So I'm gonna take a look at some of those. So somebody asked if construction costs, or in other words, the cost of land, come into play. So if the question is, does it come into play in the housing element? Yes, that's something that we gather data on and we look at as a potential constraint. It is something that is not completely within the county's control. So it's in a section that's called the market related constraints or the non-governmental constraints. And there are things that can be included in the county's efforts to perhaps subsidize projects or work to find sites, because obviously cost of land is a huge factor throughout California. But yes, it's definitely analyzed in the housing element. Another question here is, if you compare Kensington and East Richmond Heights, Kensington is closer to BART, closer to jobs in Oakland and San Francisco, is a higher opportunity neighborhood and has more area outside of the fire zone. Is Kensington going to get a bigger share of the housing inventory than East Richmond Heights? So I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but it sounds like you're looking for that to be part of the analysis. So we will definitely take that into consideration.
I will say both Kensington and East Richmond Heights sit on an earthquake fault. So there's some constraints around new residential development on earthquake faults. It's not impossible, but it's not a done deal, I guess is the way to put it. It's a little tricky.
Thanks, Amalia. There's a comment that I don't know if there's any follow-up on this, but want to read this comment. Says, I didn't get to speak to policy related to housing in the wildland urban interface. There needs to be county policies in the housing element that limit for further development in areas that are in the very high fire zones. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Obviously, this is not unique to Contra Costa County. I wonder if anyone from PlaceWorks can speak to what you're seeing for this elsewhere in the state. I assume it's coming up, but maybe it just hasn't worked its way into this cycle yet.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit in our small group, actually. So it is, we will be looking at policies and actions in the draft in coordination with the safety element team that is working on the safety element also right now for the comprehensive general plan update. And we are looking at hazards, including very high fire severity when selecting suitable sites in the housing element. In terms of state law, there is a law that was in the legislature last year that didn't pass or did not get approved to require more restriction of sites in very high fire severity zones. I'm not sure where that bill is this year. I think it is still pending. So it's possible that in the near future, there could be additional restrictions related to fire and siting of housing. Okay. Somebody said that they didn't believe there was another opportunity for public input until the draft, and could another meeting like this come back before the public draft? Not sure if that's in the cards or not, but if the county wants to speak to that right now, but we can definitely take that into consideration.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think we need to talk about when the public draft is coming and how much time there is. There's, you know, you saw on the first slide, it's a pretty accelerated schedule in terms of what the state has required of us. And of course, you know, people are free to submit comments throughout, as many people and organizations have been.
Yeah, I guess I'll note that the public draft will come out and there will be, you know, a very decent amount of time to comment, and then comments will be taken into consideration, and revisions, if there are revisions made in response to comments, then a revised draft will be released for public review before the draft is submitted to the state for review. So that will be another opportunity to take a look. So I don't see any other questions that have come my way. Maria, is that your understanding as well?
Yes, I have that same understanding.
Okay, well, just so that we don't miss anything, if anyone has anything else that we haven't talked about yet, if you want to raise your hand, and we can make sure we're getting to everyone.
And then Amy, in the meantime, maybe you want to put up the slide with the contact info.
Sure.
Thank you. So we've put 3 county folks here on this slide to stay in touch with for things that are kind of specific, or not specific, but things that originate from the general plan, like the land use draft maps. My colleague Will is the best person to start with, to just make sure you stay informed of future meetings and milestones. Please contact my colleague Susan, who's our administrative support person, and she'll make sure you're on the right list. And then other questions like, you know, thoughts about strategies, things like that, I'm the best person to start with.
Thanks, Amalia. I see that we have 2 additional questions. Maria, would you be able to just read the first one since I'm sharing my screen?
Yes, so the first question is, how will our comments be captured in the draft housing element?
So all of the public input, whether it's in a meeting, in a letter, in an email, in response to other targeted outreach that we've done, will be summarized in the draft. Once there are comments on the draft, how any revisions have been made in response to those comments will also be summarized in the subsequent drafts. So that's typically how comments are reflected. And was there another one?
Yeah. So the following question is, are there any plans to join the need for equitable income, which is to receive Measure X funding with the housing provided to those in the most need?
So I think maybe the county would be best to respond to that one.
I think I missed the first. Is it about how, is it sort of, does it boil down to, will Measure X funds for housing be prioritized for very low income households?
It sounds like that. So I'll repeat the question. So are there any plans to join the need for equitable income, which is to receive Measure X funding with the housing to provided to those in the most need?
Okay, I might be misunderstanding the question a little bit. I think maybe to answer what is going on with the Measure X money for housing, and the answer to that is that yes, the committee did recommend some allocation for affordable housing. The board quantified it and forwarded it, and it's 10 million for year 1, 12 million for year 2 and beyond. And staff is working on figuring out what the framework is going to be. So we're very much in the beginning of that and don't have anything for public input yet. But I think we all understand that this money is supposed to be used for the people in need, low income categories would be my thought. But there's a lot of competing priorities for even the housing fund. So we're not at a place yet where I can report out on any allocation plan or anything like that. We're not there yet.
There is another question. It is, will these slides be emailed to those who registered for this meeting, or do we need to find them on the county site?
We will definitely be posting them on the site as well as the recording from this meeting. And we can look into also emailing them out.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Maria, I was just going to say, I think it's fine to, other than a lot of people can't receive a big PowerPoint file. So we might have to try doing it as a PDF or something. I don't know if you guys have the mailing list of attendees. Sure. I mean, if people want that, sure,
well,
no problem. But
I
it will
think we
definitely,
can, yeah, it would definitely be a PDF for
Okay.
email purposes. And I think we should be able to do that, but we'll confirm.
So we do have 2 new questions. The first one is, if you don't have time for additional public meetings, how will you obtain input from low-income residents?
well, I think
We have been, go ahead,
Amy.
We have been doing outreach efforts since last fall. And we've had this meeting as well as the meeting with the Board of Supervisors open to everyone. So, and we will be continuing to engage as the process moves forward, even after the public draft.
Yeah, and I was going to say, maybe the person who sent that question, I'm intuiting maybe they feel like this meeting was not successful at capturing the concerns of low-income residents, and I'm certainly open to other suggestions that they might feel would be good ways to capture that input.
The next question is, will there be any consideration of tiny homes or other strategies for housing the homeless?
I believe we are considering a tiny home program, if I'm remembering correctly. And there are also programs to address housing the homeless. But yes, correct me if I'm wrong, Amalia and Christine, but I believe that is something we've talked about.
Yeah, I think we've definitely talked about it, and you know, it could certainly show up as one strategy, but you know, you can't build enough tiny homes to house all the unhoused people who need a house. So it's going to be one strategy among many as it shows up in the draft plan. And we maybe have time for one more question, and then folks are welcome to email further thoughts to me here. My contact info is still up.
So the last question is, will the assessment of fair housing be presented to the public so that comments can be made prior to the final draft of the housing element?
Yes, it will be part of the public draft. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. This was a great discussion. We really appreciate you being here. Anything else that you want to mention, Amalia, before we let everybody go for the evening?
Someone just sent me a DM with a comment, but I can't. Can you email it to me, please? Because then I can codify it better, because I can't take it out of the chat. Kevin, you please email me that comment. It's a good comment. That's all. No, so again, I really want to thank my colleagues from the county Conservation and Planning, Conservation and Development Department, as well as the entire PlaceWorks team for assembling here and sharing some of our preliminary thoughts, concerns, hearing some feedback. The folks who joined us tonight, thank you so much. Your participation is valued, your time is valuable, which is why I wanted to end at 7. Really appreciate your ongoing concern for people who need affordable housing in the county. I think that's why we all are here tonight, and we share that common interest and a mission. We're really embarking on a mission-driven project. So thank you for sharing the mission, and I look forward to continuing to discuss this with you. All right, stay tuned. Make sure you're on that mailing list. Email Susan. Bye, everyone. Good night.